Today I want to discover the man behind the headlines and uncover the truth about the guy who has been branded Britain's biggest scrounger.
Listen, you're going to criticise my family, pal, and my kids. I'll criticise you as much as I want.
Sorry,
this is a free country.
And I've got my kids, and I've got my family. That's all I care about. Nothing else.
Don't say so, then. Don't say so, then.
Can I just get if I could get the distribution of children right? Is
I've
that
got
right?
3 with my first marriage.
Yeah.
2 with another young lady. 5 with married.
Yeah.
4 with Lisa. And 1 with another young lady. And
Right.
2 on the way.
So that's 15 now,
Plus-
and 2 on the way.
Plus 1 when I was in the armed services, which I've never met.
We can't express our gratitude to everybody. I've actually been down to our home, and what we saw, we just cannot believe it.
In May 2012, a horrifying incident shocked the town of Derby and captured the attention of the entire nation. Mick Philpott, a father of 17, was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in a devastating fire that claimed the lives of 6 innocent children. The fire was no accident. It was the result of a twisted plot orchestrated by Philpott to frame a former partner who had dared to leave him. This case would reveal the dark and disturbing life of a man who had manipulated and controlled those around him with a terrifying lack of moral compass, leading to one of the most tragic and shocking criminal cases in recent British history. This script will delve into the harrowing details of Mick Philpott's life, the events leading up to the fire, the trial that followed, and the lasting impact of this tragic case on those involved and the community at large. We will explore the psychological profile of a man whose need for control and dominance led him to commit an unspeakable act, the societal factors that allowed his behavior to continue unchecked, and the tragic consequences for the innocent lives caught in his web of manipulation. Mick Philpott was a man whose life was marked by violence, control, and an insatiable need for dominance over those around him. Born in 1956, Philpott's early years were steeped in turmoil. Raised in a household where violence was normalized, Philpott quickly learned that power could be exerted through fear and aggression. This toxic upbringing laid the foundation for a life defined by manipulation, abuse, and a total disregard for the well-being of others. By the time he reached adulthood, Philpott had already established a pattern of controlling and abusing the women in his life. His relationships were not built on love or mutual respect, but on fear, coercion, and dominance. One of the most disturbing aspects of Philpott's past was his conviction in 1978 for the attempted murder of a former girlfriend. The woman had left him, and in a fit of rage, Philpott stabbed her 13 times. Miraculously, she survived the attack, but the incident set a precedent for the way Philpott would treat the women in his life going forward. This conviction became a tool of terror that Philpott used to control and manipulate other women, threatening them with the same fate if they dared to defy him. Philpott's first marriage was marked by violence and control. He had 3 children with his first wife, whom he physically and emotionally abused. Eventually, he left her for a 16-year-old girl, whom he also subjected to physical and sexual violence, threats, and emotional abuse. This pattern of behavior continued as Philpott moved from one relationship to the next, leaving a trail of damaged lives in his wake. Philpott's relationships were characterized by an extreme form of control. He isolated his partners from friends and family, dictated their every move, and subjected them to both physical and psychological abuse. This pattern was not only a reflection of Philpott's need for control, but also a way to ensure that his partners remained dependent on him, too terrified to leave or challenge his authority. In the early 2000s, Philpott met Mareed, a woman from a troubled background who saw Philpott as her guardian angel. They married, and Mareed became another victim of Philpott's control. Philpott's manipulation of Mareed was so complete that she allowed him to carry on a relationship with another woman, Lisa Willis, who even moved into their home. The relationship between Philpott, Mareed, and Willis was deeply dysfunctional. Philpott treated both women as his possessions, controlling every aspect of their lives. He dictated how they spent their money, how they raised their children, and even restricted their freedom by not allowing them to have a front door key. Philpott was the self-proclaimed kingpin of the household, and his word was law. The children in the household were subjected to a chaotic and abusive environment, where they witnessed and experienced the consequences of Philpott's violent and controlling behavior. This toxic environment would ultimately lead to a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, as Philpott's need for control spiraled into a deadly scheme that would shock the nation. In 2012, the dynamics of Mick Philpott's household changed dramatically when Lisa Willis, one of the women living with him, decided to leave. Willis took her children and moved out, an act of defiance that Philpott could not tolerate. For Philpott, the loss of control over Willis was a direct challenge to his authority, and he became obsessed with regaining control over her. In his twisted mind, the only way to achieve this was to frame Willis for a crime so severe that she would be forced back into his life. Philpott's plan was both wicked and dangerous. He decided to set fire to the family home in Derby with the intention of framing Willis for the arson. The idea was that the children would be inside the house when the fire started, and Philpott would heroically rescue them, thus discrediting Willis and winning back custody of the children. In his delusional state, Philpott believed that this plan would restore his control over Willis and allow him to maintain his position as the dominant force in his household. To carry out his plan, Philpott enlisted the help of his wife, Mayreed, and a family friend, Paul Mosley. The involvement of Mayreed in this plot highlights the extent of Philpott's control over her. Despite being the mother of the children who would be endangered by the fire, Mayreed was so deeply manipulated by Philpott that she agreed to participate in the scheme. This decision speaks to the psychological abuse that Mayreed had endured for years, leaving her unable to resist Philpott's demands. Together, they poured petrol on the floor of the house and set it alight in the early hours of the morning. The plan quickly went wrong. Instead of being the hero who rescued his children, Philpott found himself at the center of a tragic disaster. The fire spread rapidly, and despite the efforts of firefighters and neighbors, there was no chance of rescuing the children trapped inside. Jaden, 5, Jade, 10, John, 9, Jack, 8, Jesse, 6, and Duane, 13, all perished in the blaze. Their deaths were described as mercifully swift, but the terror they must have felt in their final moments is unimaginable. Philpott's reaction to the fire was nothing short of a performance. He feigned grief and shock, collapsing in front of the media and shedding tears for the cameras. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that Philpott's emotions were nothing more than a charade. His lies and manipulations began to unravel, leading to his eventual arrest and trial. The investigation into the fire revealed a horrifying level of premeditation. Philpott had not only planned the fire, but had also taken steps to cover his tracks, including fabricating evidence and attempting to manipulate witnesses. His arrogance and belief in his own invincibility were evident throughout the investigation, as he continued to deny any wrongdoing, even as the evidence against him mounted. The tragedy of the fire was compounded by the realization that it could have been prevented. The warning signs of Philpott's dangerous behavior had been present for years, but the system had failed to intervene. The deaths of the 6 children were a devastating reminder of the consequences of unchecked abuse and control and the failure of society to protect the most vulnerable. The courtroom was tense as the trial of Mick Philpott, Mayreed Philpott, and Paul Mosley unfolded. Over the course of several weeks, the jury was presented with a barrage of evidence that painted a horrifying picture of a man who was not just a manipulator, but a master of psychological warfare. Mick Philpott had spent years honing his ability to control those around him, using a combination of charm, intimidation, and emotional abuse to bend others to his will. The prosecution, led by Richard Latham QC, meticulously laid out the sequence of events leading up to the fire. They described how Philpott had orchestrated every detail of the plan, from the timing of the fire to the placement of the petrol that would be used as an accelerant. Latham emphasized that this was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but a premeditated act of arson designed to manipulate the courts into granting him custody of his children. Key to the prosecution's case was the testimony of forensic experts who had examined the scene of the fire. They testified that the fire had been started deliberately, with petrol poured through the letterbox and ignited using a match or lighter. The evidence pointed to a clear conclusion. This was no accident. The prosecution argued that Philpott had intended to save the children from the fire at the last minute, thereby appearing as a hero, but the plan had gone tragically wrong. Throughout the trial, Mick Philpott maintained his innocence, insisting that he had loved his children and would never have harmed them. However, his behavior in the courtroom told a different story. At times, Philpott appeared defiant, glaring at the prosecution and even making inappropriate comments. His arrogance was palpable, and it was clear that he believed he could outwit the court just as he had outwitted so many others in his life. This hubris would prove to be his downfall. The prosecution also delved into Philpott's past, revealing a history of domestic abuse, control, and manipulation. Witnesses described how Philpott had systematically isolated Mayreed from her family and friends, cutting her off from any support system that might have helped her escape his influence. This isolation was a key factor in Philpott's ability to maintain control over Mayreed and to coerce her into participating in the plot. Mayreed Philpott's role in the crime was a focal point of the trial. The defense argued that she had been a victim of Philpott's manipulation, coerced into going along with the plan out of fear and desperation. Mayreed's barrister, Sean Smith QC, portrayed her as a woman trapped in an abusive relationship, unable to see a way out. He described how Mick had exerted total control over her life, dictating everything from her daily routine to her interactions with others. Mayreed, Smith argued, had been so thoroughly dominated by Philpott that she believed she had no choice but to comply with his demands. However, the prosecution countered this narrative by pointing to Mayreed's actions on the night of the fire. They argued that while she may have been a victim of abuse, she was also an active participant in the crime. She had helped Philpott and Mosley plan the fire, and she had been present when the petrol was poured through the letterbox. The jury was left to decide whether Mayreed's actions were the result of coercion, or if she bore equal responsibility for the deaths of her children. Paul Mosley's involvement in the plot added another layer of complexity to the case. A longtime friend of Mick Philpott, Mosley had been drawn into the scheme with the promise of financial gain. The court heard how Mosley had eagerly agreed to help Philpott, believing that he would share in the benefits once the plan succeeded. Like Mayreed, Mosley attempted to distance himself from the crime during the trial, claiming that he had been manipulated by Philpott. However, the evidence showed that Mosley had been a willing participant, fully aware of the risks involved. The jury's verdict was a damning indictment of all three defendants. Mick Philpott was found guilty of manslaughter, with the court recognizing that while he may not have intended to kill his children, his reckless actions had directly led to their deaths. Mayreed Philpott and Paul Mosley were also found guilty of manslaughter, with the jury concluding that they had played active roles in the plot and bore responsibility for the tragic outcome. The public reaction to the trial and its outcome was one of overwhelming outrage and grief. The case had gripped the nation from the moment the fire was first reported, and as the details of the crime emerged, the sense of shock deepened. The idea that a father could so callously sacrifice the lives of his own children for personal gain was incomprehensible to many, and the case became a focal point for discussions about domestic abuse, child protection, and the failures of the system. The media played a significant role in shaping public opinion, with extensive coverage of the trial and the events leading up to it. Newspapers and television programs provided in-depth analyses of Mick Philpott's character, portraying him as a manipulative and dangerous individual who had terrorized those around him for years. The public was inundated with images of the fire-ravaged house, the grieving relatives, and the mugshots of the three convicted individuals. These images became symbolic of the senseless loss of life and the need for justice. In the days following the verdict, there were calls for greater scrutiny of the social services and legal systems that had failed to protect the Philpott children. Critics argued that the warning signs had been there all along. Mick Philpott's history of violence, his volatile relationships, and his manipulative behavior. Yet the system had not intervened in time to prevent the tragedy. The case prompted a wave of inquiries and reviews aimed at identifying the gaps in the system and finding ways to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Vigils were held across the country in memory of the 6 children, with thousands of people coming together to mourn their loss. In Derby, the community united in grief, with local residents organizing fundraisers to support the surviving family members and to raise awareness of the issues highlighted by the case. The outpouring of public support was a testament to the profound impact that the tragedy had on people from all walks of life. The case also sparked a broader conversation about the nature of domestic abuse and the challenges faced by victims. Many people were shocked to learn of the extent of Mick Philpott's control over his household, and the case became a catalyst for discussions about the signs of coercive control and the need for better support for those trapped in abusive relationships. Advocacy groups seized the opportunity to push for changes in the law, including the recognition of coercive control as a form of domestic abuse and the introduction of measures to protect victims. In the aftermath of the trial, the government announced a series of reforms aimed at improving the response to domestic abuse and protecting vulnerable children. These included increased funding for domestic violence shelters, the introduction of new training programs for social workers and law enforcement, and the creation of specialized units to handle cases involving complex family dynamics. While these measures were welcomed by many, there was also a recognition that much more needed to be done to address the root causes of domestic abuse and to prevent tragedies like the Philpott case from happening again. The Philpott case had far-reaching implications, both in terms of the legal system and society's understanding of domestic abuse. It highlighted the complexities of cases involving coercive control, where the abuser exerts such dominance over the victim that they feel unable to escape or resist. This form of abuse, while less visible than physical violence, can be just as devastating, leaving victims isolated, fearful, and completely under the abuser's control. The case underscored the need for a more nuanced approach to domestic abuse, one that takes into account the psychological and emotional dimensions of the abuse as well as the physical. It also raised important questions about the role of social services, the police, and the courts in identifying and responding to cases of coercive control. There were calls for better training for professionals involved in these cases, so they could recognize the signs of coercion and take appropriate action. In response to these concerns, the government and various organizations began to focus more attention on the issue of coercive control. Campaigns were launched to raise awareness among the public about what coercive control looks like and how to recognize it. Training programs for social workers, law enforcement officers, and legal professionals were updated to include information on identifying and responding to coercive control. These efforts aimed to ensure that cases like the Philpott tragedy would be less likely to fall through the cracks in the future. Another significant implication of the case was the impact it had on public perceptions of the welfare system. Mick Philpott's life of dependency on state benefits, combined with his manipulation of the system for personal gain, became a focal point for discussions about the welfare state and its vulnerabilities. Some sections of the media and political commentators used the case to argue for reforms to the welfare system, suggesting that it was too easy for individuals like Philpott to exploit the system and that more stringent checks and balances were needed. This aspect of the case sparked a heated debate about the balance between providing support for those in need and preventing abuse of the system. While there was broad agreement that the welfare system should be there to help the most vulnerable, the Philpott case raised questions about how to ensure that support was not misused. Some argued for tighter controls on benefits and more rigorous assessments of those claiming state support, while others cautioned against policies that might penalize those who genuinely needed help. Ultimately, the case of Mick Philpott serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked abuse and manipulation. It highlights the importance of vigilance and early intervention by authorities, as well as the need for a society that is informed and aware of the signs of domestic abuse. The tragedy of the Philpott children is a somber testament to the need for ongoing efforts to protect the most vulnerable members of our communities and to ensure that justice is served in even the most complex and challenging cases. The Mick Philpott case is a deeply disturbing chapter in the annals of true crime. It serves as a grim reminder of the lengths to which some individuals will go in pursuit of their own selfish desires, even at the cost of innocent lives. However, it is also a case that has prompted important reflections and reforms, particularly in the areas of domestic abuse and child protection. As society continues to grapple with the complexities of domestic abuse, the lessons learned from the Philpott case remain relevant. It underscores the need for a comprehensive approach to tackling abuse, one that recognizes the many forms it can take and provides the necessary support for victims to escape and rebuild their lives. It also calls for continued vigilance and proactive intervention by those tasked with protecting the vulnerable, ensuring that tragedies like the one that befell the Philpott children are never repeated. The legacy of this case, while rooted in tragedy, is one of change and progress. It has led to greater awareness of coercive control, more robust responses to domestic abuse, and a recognition of the need to protect those who cannot protect themselves. As we remember the 6 young lives lost, we must also commit to the ongoing work of building a safer and more just society, one where no child is ever again put at risk by the actions of those meant to care for them. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the haunting and heartbreaking story of the Derby family. If you found this narrative compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel for more gripping and thought-provoking content. Don't forget to like, share, and comment below with your thoughts on this case and any other stories you'd like us to cover.